Startups, what's that? Your idea is good for nothing, or why the startup turns into a fuck-up. Hey, you're watching PROfintech. My name is Andres. A funny thing happened to me the other day. We were looking for a small office for one project, and at one of the facilities, the owner of the premises said, "If you're a startup, I won't rent out this office to you." What? Was he serious? Did he really think we wouldn't be able to pay the rent? In the meantime, he continued, "I bet that you will move out as soon as your team grows 5 times in 3 months. And you know what? He was fundamentally wrong. As a rule, startup teams are slow to grow, but the same can't be said for their profit. A good annual growth for a startup is 100 times. In this episode, we'll tell you about the companies called startups and how they manage to grow 100-fold. You will also learn why 9 out of 10 startups turn into a fuck-up. Even though the word startup has firmly entered our vocabulary and is used quite frequently, many people can only guess what it really means. For some, it is a small business for young people or an online business. For others, it is any newly created company. A startup indeed is a young company with a short history. It can be old because it either successfully develops into a big business or changes its vector or shuts down. A different story is when a company has been trying and failing to implement the same idea for 5 or more years. That being said, the main and mandatory attributes of a startup are explosive growth, repeatability, and scalability. And this is what makes a startup different from a classic company. Startups grow tens to hundreds of times faster than classic companies, and the main reason for that is that their business models are mainly geared towards global application. Any local business, be it a shop, beauty shop, or an agency, is limited to a certain radius of service provision, which can't grow endlessly. Therefore, it would be wrong to call such projects startups. A startup business, in turn, is practically unlimited both in terms of location and the number of potential customers because of its repeatability. That is, the company's ability to sell its products and services many times, and also because of its scalability, the ability to increase its customer base and profit. In doing so, startups don't make any changes to the chosen business model and don't increase their investments. So, there is no need in fast startup team growth. The resources required for work are not directly dependent on the company's growth. They grow linearly rather than proportionally to the growth in sales. As a matter of fact, some business gurus call startups temporary organizations needed solely to find that very workable, profitable, and scalable business model. In other words, a startup as such exists only as long as a suitable business model is being searched for. Once it has been found and the business processes are optimized, the project ceases to exist. It either turns into a usual business or is sold. At the same time, if the goal is not achieved, that is, if the business model doesn't work or is not found at all, the project is closed without waiting for a return on investment. Another clear side of startups is that their business is aimed at solving a problem. Startups find a process needed by and causing real pain to the general public and seek to solve it in a non-conventional way. They look for creative ways to get around the everyday problems faced by thousands and millions of people worldwide, and in most cases, take an innovative approach. Neil Blumenthal, CEO of Warby Parker, told Forbes, "A startup is a company working to solve a problem where the solution is not obvious and success is not guaranteed." The point is that startups, for the most part, feel safe to experiment. They dream of making the world a better place and tend to solve problems in an extraordinary way. This is very common in technology. Many startups are emerging because of, and sometimes in opposition to, the latest technology. For instance, the development of artificial intelligence has not only opened up a host of new opportunities and technological solutions, but also has given rise to many problems. Now, decisions are to be made to keep clever gadgets from taking control over us. In some cases, the development of one technology allows using the other one in a new way. For instance, the evolution of smartphones has made it possible to look at the previously existed geolocation with new eyes. In other words, we have for a long time been able to determine the location of a device using GPS. But embedding a service into convenient mobile apps, convenient interface software has only become possible with the advent of smartphones. The same applies to NFC. The technology has existed since 2004, but it had no sensible application until recently. It was only because of the new software that we learned to open electronic locks, charge devices wirelessly, exchange files, and pay for purchases this way. So, technology and innovation have become the calling card of startups and a great way to find a unique startup idea. Your idea is good for nothing until you or someone else implements it. People were previously afraid to openly say about their extremely interesting idea that hadn't been realized by anyone. Now, ideas can belong to the public domain. It is only the implementation, the solution that is truly appreciated rather than the ideas, no matter how powerful they are. In real life, it is almost impossible to reinvent the wheel. It is difficult to even imagine something that no one else has ever proposed. So the only thing startups can do is act in reverse. Look around carefully, find a problem, and solve it. Let's say there existed some kind of service, but its structure was extremely inconvenient, or using it could cause additional complications. Startups are the ones to solve such issues. Let's take the online taxi service Uber as an example. Taxi service as such has existed since time immemorial, but we started booking a taxi through mobile apps not so long ago. It turned out to be so convenient and we liked it so much that today hardly anyone remembers the last time they booked a taxi through the taxi dispatcher system. The reason for that is that Uber and its followers have solved this problem. Choosing the most suitable taxi service, getting it on the phone, explaining where exactly you are and then waiting for the taxi. All that caused certain difficulties. It was uncomfortable after all. Meanwhile, the application can easily determine your location and the location of the taxi that is going to pick you up. You can see which car is available and how soon it will arrive. To cut a long story short, the application offers everything to make this service truly irreplaceable. By the way, did you know that there are three main types of startups? They are affectionately called aggressive alien, a dark horse, and successful copy. In its history, Uber is an aggressive alien. When it was entering the market with a new idea, a huge fleet of vehicles and a reserve of investments for price dumping, the startup crowded out its main competitors, the existing taxi services, before anyone could say Jack Robinson. Meanwhile, those who copied Uber in the local markets around the world are its successful copies. Lyft in the USA, Bolt in the Baltics, Didi in China, and now Yandex Taxi in Russia. They all adapted the service to local needs. Another classic example of successful copies are a variety of social networks mirroring Facebook all around the globe. Dark horses are projects with a vague future, inaccurate profit forecasts, and an unclear prospect of further development. It is rather risky to invest time and money in such projects. That's why only a few of the most bold ideas make it to the launch. In its development, any startup goes through 5 stages of business life cycles. Some sources define more phases, but we will talk about the main ones. At this stage, you should conduct market research, develop a plan, and get ready to launch your project. This stage can last the longest, up to several years. At the launch stage, a working product model, a prototype, is created. It has the basic functions of the product and clearly demonstrates the idea of a startup. A working prototype is released to the market for testing and feedback. If the product receives a positive response from consumers and starts generating revenue, it automatically enters the growth stage. Volumes should keep growing, and the project should reach viability. The next is the expansion stage. If at the previous stages the project started seeing profits, the product has proven itself and is in demand. It can be scaled up. Depending on the business model, you can use adjoining market areas or open new markets. The final stage is exit. At this stage, the startup finally justifies itself in full, brings profits to investors. There are 2 exit strategies: turning a project into a classic business or entering an IPO, opening the sale of own shares on the stock market. This is the company's entry into the stock market, where the sale of its shares begins. The IPO purpose is to attract new financial investments in business development as well as increase the company's prestige and value. Where to find money? This is the question any project faces sooner or later. When it comes to startups, sooner doesn't apply. Funding in the early stages is more difficult to attract, so projects, as a rule, survive on the sheer enthusiasm of the team members for a long time. They develop a prototype using their own resources and at their own expense. They approach professional investors only when they have a ready-to-launch product on hand. Investors are an integral part of the startup ecosystem. Let's discuss the classic ways to finance them. The bootstrap method, or bootstrapping, is equity or private loan financing. The advantage of this method is the preservation of independence from investors, at least at the initial stages of the project. The downside is that bringing the project to growth and scaling is impossible without additional investment. This way, the idea is usually just tested. For instance, they check how a business model works, create a product prototype or MVP, minimum viable product. A minimum viable product is a stripped-down version of a finished product that has the minimum satisfactory set of features. This is necessary to attract the first consumers and conduct the first test in real conditions. The purpose of MVPs is to get feedback, check all assumptions and hypotheses before the product is developed further. With a minimal set of functions, the costs and risks are lower. If the product doesn't work, there will be minimal losses. Friends, family, and fools are usually the first to invest in a project. Moreover, the latter are people who invest money because they trust the borrower and believe in his or her project. They got such an awkward name because usually such people are not business sharks but rather inexperienced investors. Just like self-financing, this is a good way to start a project and create a minimum viable product so that it could later be presented to professional investors. Another way to find early funding is for business angels. That is, private investors focused on long-term profit. Their investments are often quite risky, and their motives are different from those of other investors. Apart from direct profit, they are also interested in helping the project or good people, in exchange for a percentage of the profit or share in the business. Business angels do not stand aside, but are active participants in the business development. They become mentors and render support. Young company funding alone may not be enough. If business angels can help with work structuring, making useful connections, building a reputation, this will significantly increase their chances of potential profit. Such investments have a shorter payback period, from 6 months to 2 years. Unlike business angels, venture capitalists are attracted by promising projects that have already entered the market. Venture capital funds are large investment companies choosing to work with innovative enterprises and projects. They look for projects with extremely high expected returns and are not afraid of the associated risks. As a rule, 70 to 80% of projects do not return investment to investors, but the profit from the remaining 20 to 30% pays for all losses. The typical term for a venture capital investment is from 2 to 5 years. There are other options for how to launch your startup and get both funding and support at the earliest stages. Tech parks, business incubators, and business accelerators are the programs interested in project development starting from the pre-seed stage, that is, from the very first steps. Such organizations provide full support and the entire infrastructure. By becoming a member, a startup gets training, co-working jobs, a mentor willing to share his or her experience and connections, and of course, phased funding. How do investors choose startups that will get off the ground? We already know that explosive growth is the reason why investors are willing to fund startups. Profit can be cosmic, but the number of incoming applications is infinite. What does an investor pay attention to when choosing projects? The 3 decisive factors distinguished against a general background are as follows: uniqueness of the idea and copyright to it, development plan and exit strategy, team, which according to experts is the most important factor. To successfully convey the first 2 points to the investor, a competent presentation is needed. In the startup industry, a brief presentation is called a pitch, from the English throwing or serving a ball in baseball. The relationship is direct. Your presentation should be as concise, structured, targeted, and straightforward as a good pitch. The purpose of the pitch is to hook the investor and get funding. And this must be done very quickly. Duration-wise, there are 3 types of pitches: 1 minute, 3 minute, and 10-minute long. The shortest 1-minute presentation is called an elevator pitch. This is the amount of time you will actually have to communicate with a potential investor if you accidentally find yourself face-to-face with him or her in an elevator. In a minute, you need to clearly outline the problem, its solution, and the startup's earning prospects. If you have a little more time for communication, let's say 3 minutes, you will be able to pitch your idea. In this case, you can pay attention to the business model, tell what market research has been carried out, mention your project name, and your team. If you are truly lucky to get stuck in the elevator with the investor, you will have 10 minutes to talk. This type of presentation can also be found in professional startup battles. Funding pitch is fully-fledged request for project funding. It includes all of the above elements, as well as competitor research, an exit strategy, a progress report, and the required amount of funding. For most investors, team assessment is a really critical factor. Judging by the teams matching the level of project's complexity, team play, and experience of the team members, it is possible to give a fairly clear forecast regarding the success of the whole business, which the team takes up. A strong team is a stable sign of great opportunities. By the way, the most effective way to assess a team is to analyze various competencies or skills of team members. In an ideal scenario, the team should have leaders recognized in their respective fields. There is a classic recipe from Silicon Valley: hacker, hustler, and hipster. As we would have it, it is a techie, marketer, and designer aka creative lead. 2 to 3 project co-founders with clearly separated responsibility areas are the key to success at the start. Other valuable specialists can be recruited as the project grows. The team can be built up linearly and outsourced. This is beneficial and convenient for the tasks not related to key management functions. Startup team members should create their own schedules, self-monitor implementation thereof, and generally treat the business as owners. Each team member should be ready to take responsibility for the success of the entire project. Everyone in their area should be ready to work as intensively as possible. Working in a startup in the early stages takes all the time from the team. At the same time, they don't get paid for their work or work for a token fee, or are giving nothing but promises of a share of potential earnings in the future. By the way, did you know that in 2018, CB Insight's business analysts conducted a study and named the 3 most common causes of startup failures? In common terms, this phenomenon is briefly and clearly called a fuck-up. Such reasons as no market need and ran out of cash are at the top of this chart, followed by not the right team, which is also the reason why almost 25% of all startups fail. At the same time, this fact has an inversely proportional relationship. If the team is able to completely distribute all responsibilities and cope with them without losing team spirit, the chances of launching a project increase significantly. There is a startup boom in the modern world. Right now, most of the people involved in startup projects are working on something that will never become successful. 9 out of 10 startups will unavoidably fuck up. But this doesn't stop new players from entering the idea market almost every day. We now know that a startup is a special kind of business. It is launched from scratch by a team of like-minded people who enthusiastically develop an idea so convincing that it receives funding without any financial guarantees. See you in the next Pros.